There are places on earth where the past does not whisper. It shouts. In the highlands of what is now Zimbabwe, in the broad valley south of the Masvingo Plateau, the stone walls rise from the African earth with a permanence that 8 centuries of abandonment have not diminished. They are massive. They are precise. They are built without mortar, without the cement or adhesive that every European architectural tradition considered the fundamental requirement of monumental construction. And they have not fallen. Granite blocks, cut from the kopjes that stud the surrounding landscape, like the bones of the earth pushing through its skin, shaped and fitted with a care that turned raw stone into something that functions, still as a statement. Not a statement in words. A statement in weight and scale, and the absolute refusal to be ignored. The walls of Great Zimbabwe are not ruins in the conventional sense. They are not the broken remnants of something that once stood complete, and has since been reduced by time to fragments, requiring imaginative reconstruction. They stand. The Great Enclosure, the largest single prehistoric structure in sub-Saharan Africa, its outer wall 11 meters high at its peak, 250 meters in circumference, built from an estimated 1 million dressed granite blocks, stands today as it stood when the last inhabitants left. In the 15th century, the fires of their hearths gone cold, the grain bins empty, the royal court dissolved into the political reorganization that brought Great Zimbabwe's era to its close. The walls stood through the abandonment. They stood through the centuries of silence. They stood through the arrival of European colonizers who could not, would not, accept what the walls told them about who had built them. The land around the walls is the land of the Zimbabwean plateau, the high veld, that elevated interior of the southern African subcontinent, where the altitude moderates what might otherwise be a tropical climate into something more temperate, where the grasslands support the cattle that were, in the civilization that built Great Zimbabwe, the measure of all wealth, and the foundation of all power. The Zambezi River runs along the plateau's northern edge, the Limpopo along its southern border, and between them, in the sweet spot of altitude and rainfall and grazing land, and made the plateau one of the most productive agricultural and pastoral environments in sub-Saharan Africa. The civilization of the plateau peoples developed, across centuries, the organizational complexity and the economic power that found its highest expression in the stone-walled city that rose, between the 11th and 15th centuries, to become the capital of an empire. The name itself is a statement. Zimbabwe, from the Shona Zimbabwe, the houses of stone, or in another interpretation, Zimbabwe, the venerated houses, is a word that contains within it an entire world's self-understanding. These were not simply buildings. They were the houses of the great. The enclosures of the powerful. The stone expressions of an authority whose legitimacy was built into the material from landscape itself, granite from the hills, shaped by human hands, assembled into walls that communicated, to everyone who approached them, the specific message that a civilization in command of its world sends to anyone who might question its command. The questions began with the Europeans. When the Portuguese, probing northward from their Mozambican coastal settlements in the early 16th century, began to hear reports of a great stone city in the interior, a city of walls without mortar, of gold and cattle, and a king whose authority extended across an enormous territory. They embedded those reports in a framework that their civilization provided and that their ideology required. The legend of Prester John, the mythical Christian king of Africa, whose realm their explorers had been seeking for a century. The Queen of Sheba, whose biblical wealth they mapped onto the African interior, with the selective reading of people who needed the gold to come from somewhere their frameworks could accommodate. The civilization of ancient Phoenicia or Arabia or Egypt, any source, any attribution, any explanation that placed the origin of the walls outside Africa, and outside the African people who were demonstrably living among them when the Portuguese arrived. The denial was systematic. It was also, by the standards of the evidence available even in the 16th century, intellectually dishonest. The Portuguese reports themselves described a city inhabited by the ancestors of the people the Portuguese were encountering, Karanga-speaking Shona peoples whose traditions connected them directly to the builders of the stone walls. The oral traditions were there. The material continuity was there. The people were there. The denial was not a failure of evidence. It was a failure of willingness to accept what the evidence said. The willingness would not come for centuries. And in the meantime, the stone city would wait, patient as stone is patient, enduring as granite endures, for the world to develop the intellectual and moral framework required to hear what it was saying. It was saying we were here. We built this. This is what we were. The walls do not need translation. They never did. The civilization that built Great Zimbabwe did not appear suddenly. It grew slowly, organically, across centuries of accumulation. From the specific conditions of the Zimbabwean plateau and the specific capabilities of the Bantu-speaking peoples who had been farming and herding on that plateau since the first millennium of the Common Era. The Shona-speaking peoples of the plateau, or more precisely, their ancestors, the Karanga-speaking communities from whom the historical Shona identity developed, were farmers and herders who had been working the plateau's productive soils for generations, before the first stone walls at Zimbabwe were laid. They grew sorghum and millet in the plateau's red soils. They kept cattle, the zebu cattle that were adapted to the southern African environment, hardy animals whose management required the specific knowledge of people who'd been living with them for generations. They smelted iron from the plateau's ore deposits, producing tools and weapons. They traded with each other, and with the networks that connected the interior plateau to the Indian Ocean coast, where Arab and Swahili merchants had been operating for centuries and whose commercial reach extended deep into the African interior through the rivers and the overland roads that connected the coast to the gold-bearing regions of the plateau. The gold was the pivot. The Zimbabwean plateau sits atop one of the richest gold-bearing geological formations in southern Africa, the Archean Craton, whose ancient rocks contained the alluvial gold deposits that the plateau's rivers had been concentrating in their beds for geological time. The people of the plateau had been mining this gold, placer mining in the riverbeds, shaft mining in the more concentrated deposits, for centuries before the structures at Great Zimbabwe were built. They traded it northward and eastward, through the Swahili trading networks, to the Indian Ocean coast at Sofala and beyond, to the dhow routes that carried African gold to Arabia, and ultimately to the markets of the medieval Islamic world, where African gold was a commodity of fundamental economic importance. The connection between gold, cattle, and political authority was the economic foundation on which the civilization of Great Zimbabwe was built. A man with cattle was wealthy. A man with many cattle was powerful. A man who controlled the trade routes through which gold moved from the interior mines to the coastal markets was something more than powerful. He was the organizing principle of an economy that connected the Zimbabwean plateau to the commercial networks of the Indian Ocean world. And the tribute and taxation that flowed from that control was the material basis of the political authority that the stone walls expressed. The earliest stone constructions on the Zimbabwe Hill, the Hill Complex, which would become the ritual and political center of Great Zimbabwe's upper precinct, date to the 11th century. They were not, at that stage, the massive constructions that later centuries would produce. They were more modest. Stone enclosures on the granite kopje, using the natural features of the hill as their foundation. Building walls that followed the contours of the rock rather than imposing a geometric order on the landscape. They were, in their early form, the architectural expression of a political authority that was real but not yet at the scale that the later great enclosure would represent. The people who built them lived in a world of regional political competition, a landscape of chiefdoms and nascent kingdoms whose boundaries were defined by the reach of their cattle networks and the control of their trade routes. The plateau was not politically unified. It was a mosaic of communities, each organized around its own cattle economy, its own local trade networks, its own senior lineages whose authority was expressed in the familiar African political forms of the era. The control of rain-making, the management of the ancestral spirits whose goodwill determined the community's prosperity, the maintenance of the relationships with neighboring communities through a marriage alliance on cattle exchange, and the careful management of the competition for grazing land that the plateau's prosperity always contained. What distinguished the community at Zimbabwe from its neighbors was not, initially, some obvious political or military superiority. It was position. The site sits at the junction of two ecological zones, the high-veld grasslands to the north and west, optimal for cattle grazing, and the low-veld regions to the south and east, through which the trade routes to the Sofala coast ran. A community positioned at this junction was positioned to mediate, to tax and control the flow of cattle products, and gold between the interior and the coast. And the community at Zimbabwe, over the course of the 11th and 12th centuries, developed that positional advantage into something that looked, increasingly, like political and economic dominance over the surrounding region. The rulers who managed this development, the Mambo, the Karanga word for king, whose authority at Zimbabwe would grow across the 12th and 13th centuries into the organizing principle of the entire plateau, were building something new. Not new in the sense that it had no predecessors, the plateau's political traditions, the cattle economy's organizational logic, the trade network's commercial structures were all developments of older patterns. But new in the sense that the scale of what was being assembled, the territory, the population, the economic integration, the political coherence, was exceeding what the plateau had previously produced. And the stone walls were its expression, the first walls, the first enclosures, the first statement in granite that someone here had decided to build something that would last longer than a lifetime. The decision once made would compound across centuries into something extraordinary. The construction of Great Zimbabwe was not an event. It was a process, slow, cumulative, spanning generations, each generation adding to what the previous generation had built. Each addition reflecting the growing power and ambition of the political authority that was directing the construction. The earliest significant period of construction, in the 11th and 12th centuries, focused on the hill complex, the granite kopje that rises steeply above the surrounding valley, and that provided, for the community's political and spiritual leadership, that both a defensible position and a location whose elevation expressed authority in the most direct and legible way available height. Those who lived above looked down on those who lived below. The ancestors whose shrines occupied the high places were closer the spiritual forces that governed the world. The ruler who controlled the hilltop controlled the symbolic geography of the entire landscape. The walls of the hill complex were built in the distinctive style that would define Great Zimbabwe's architecture throughout its history. Dry, stone construction, using granite blocks quarried from the natural outcrops that the hill's geology provided in abundance. The technique was not primitive. It was sophisticated, the selection of stones of compatible sizes and shapes, the fitting of each block to its neighbors with a precision that did not require mortar because the fitting itself, done correctly, was sufficient to hold the structure together through the natural forces of gravity and friction. The builders understood their material. They understood how granite splits along its natural cleavage planes, how it can be shaped by the application of fire and water, and the knowledge of a craftsman who has spent years learning the specific way that stone responds to human intention. The political context of this early construction period was one of regional competition, the community at Zimbabwe asserting its authority over neighboring communities through the combination of trade control, military capability, and the symbolic power of the stone enclosures that no neighboring community was building on the same scale. The cattle economy was the mechanism of political expansion. Cattle, captured from defeated neighbors, increased the winning chief's wealth, and the increased wealth could be converted into more followers, more warriors, more control over the trade routes, and more resources for the construction that expressed and reinforced the authority being assembled. The gold trade was developing its connections with the coastal networks in this period. The Swahili merchants of the East African coast, whose commercial reach was extending inland, along the rivers and overland routes, who were seeking direct connections with the gold, producing connections of the interior rather than relying on the long chains of intermediary traders through whom gold had previously reached the coast. Great Zimbabwe's position, and the political authority of its rulers, made it an attractive partner for the Swahili merchants, a sufficiently powerful and organized entity to guarantee the security of trade, to enforce the contracts that long-distance commerce requires, and to mobilize the labor that gold mining and the management of large cattle herds demanded. The early 13th century appears to represent an acceleration of Great Zimbabwe's growth, an increase in the scale of construction, in the complexity of the site's organization, and in the reach of the political authority centered on it. The valley ruins, the complex of stone enclosures in the valley below the hill, began to develop in this period. As the population of the Zimbabwe settlement grew beyond the capacity of the hill to accommodate it, and the settlement expanded into the valley floor. The organization of the valley complex, the distribution of enclosures of different sizes and different apparent functions, the hierarchy of access and proximity to the central great enclosure, reflects the development of a more elaborate social and political hierarchy than the earlier period's simpler arrangements. The Mambo, the king at the center of this expanding system, was not merely a powerful chief in the traditional sense. He was becoming something more, the mediating figure between the spiritual forces that determined the plateau's prosperity and the human communities whose welfare depended on that prosperity, the organizer of the gold and cattle trade that connected the plateau to the wider world, the architect of a political system that was incorporating neighboring communities not merely by force, but through the network of obligations and relationships that cattle exchange and trade partnership produced. He was, in the language of political science, state building, creating the institutional structures that converted the raw material of power into the durable form of governance. And the stone was his language. Each new wall, each new enclosure, each addition to the hill complex or the expanding valley settlement, was a statement in the most permanent medium available, a declaration that this authority was not temporary, not contingent on any single ruler's lifetime, not dependent on the continued exercise of military force for its maintenance. Stone says this was built to last. Stone says, the people who built this understood themselves to be building for their children's children's children, for the generations who would inherit what they created and be defined by it. The walls were rising. The gold was flowing. The cattle were multiplying. And something was being built at Zimbabwe that the plateau had never seen before. The political history of the Zimbabwean plateau in the 12th and 13th centuries is a story of successive hegemonies, of political centers rising to dominance, reaching the limits of what their specific organizational capacity could sustain, and then being succeeded by new centers whose innovations allowed them to extend the plateau's political integration to a new level. Before Great Zimbabwe reached its full development, the dominant political center of the plateau was Mapangobwe, the stone-walled capital of a kingdom in the Limpopo Valley, whose gold trade with the East African coast had made it, in the 12th and early 13th centuries, the most politically and economically powerful entity in southern Africa. Mapangobwe was, in its time, what Great Zimbabwe would become in its time. The organizing center of a trade network, the residence of whose authority was expressed in stone and gold, the nexus of the connections between the African interior and the Indian Ocean commercial world, the relationship between Mapangobwe and Great Zimbabwe. Whether the latter was a successor state that emerged from the former's political tradition, a tributary that grew to outpace its overlord, or a separate development that replaced Mapangobwe as the dominant power through the simple mechanism of climatic change making the Limpopo Valley less productive for cattle, is a question that archaeology has not fully resolved, and that the absence of written records from the period makes it unlikely to resolve definitively. What is clear is the trajectory. Mapangobwe declined in the 13th century, and Great Zimbabwe rose to dominance in the same period. Whether these were causally connected or coincidental, the result was the same. The center of plateau power moved northward, onto the high veld, to the stone enclosures in the valleys south of the Vingo Plateau. The kingdom that organized itself around Great Zimbabwe in the 13th and 14th centuries is referred to in the historical literature as the Kingdom of Zimbabwe, or, in the later form of its political identity, as the early Mutapa state. The precursor to the Mutapa Empire, that would be the political form of plateau power. When the Portuguese arrived in the 16th century, the political system was organized around the Mambo, the king, whose authority rested on several simultaneous foundations: the control of the gold and cattle trade, the performance of the ritual functions that maintained the community's relationship with the Mandoro spirit mediums whose ancestral power governed rainfall and agricultural prosperity, and the military capability to enforce tribute demands on the regional chiefs whose territories constituted the kingdom. The tributary system that radiated outward from Great Zimbabwe was the political expression of this authority. Regional chiefs, Sadonhu, headmen who governed the plateau's various communities, acknowledged the Mambo's authority through the payment of tribute: gold dust, cattle, grain, iron tools, the products of the regional economies that the Mambo's trade networks connected to the coastal markets. In exchange, they received the protection of the Mambo's military force against external threats and, crucially, access to the trade network itself, the ability to participate in the gold and cattle trade that was generating the plateau's prosperity and whose benefits the Mambo distributed through the tributary system to maintain the loyalty of the regional chiefs who constituted his kingdom's political structure. The gold was the key. The plateau's geology was producing gold in quantities that the Indian Ocean trade networks were eager to absorb. Arab and Swahili merchants at Sofala, the coastal trading port that served as the primary export point for the interior's gold, were paying for it with the goods that the plateau's elite desired: cotton cloth from India, glass beads from the Middle East and South Asia, Chinese porcelain, whose presence at Great Zimbabwe in the archaeological record is one of the most striking material evidences of the site's international connections. The celadon and blue and white ceramics that archaeologists have recovered from Great Zimbabwe's ruins were not local products. They were Chinese, Indian, Persian, the material evidence of a trade network that connected the Zimbabwean highlands to the most commercially sophisticated economies of the medieval world. The Mambo controlled this connection. He controlled the rates at which gold left the plateau. He controlled the access of coastal merchants to the interior markets. He controlled, through the tributary system, the flow of gold from the regional mining communities to the central trade apparatus at Zimbabwe. This control was not merely economic, it was political and spiritual simultaneously. In the Karanga understanding of the world, the prosperity of the land was the gift of the ancestral spirits, mediated through the Mambo and the Mandoro mediums who communicated with those spirits on the community's behalf. A king whose kingdom was prosperous was, by this logic, a king whose spiritual connections were functioning correctly. The gold trade's prosperity confirmed the Mambo's legitimacy. The legitimacy justified the Mambo's control of the trade. The control of the trade maintained the prosperity that confirmed the legitimacy. It was a self-reinforcing system of extraordinary stability. The Great Enclosure was in this period of maximum power, the 13th and 14th centuries, when the kingdom at Zimbabwe was at the height of its political authority. The massive outer wall, 1,000,000 dressed granite blocks, 11 meters high, constructed with the same dry stone technique as the earlier walls, but on a scale that dwarfs everything that preceded it, was not a defensive structure. There are no arrow slots, no defensive towers, no feature that makes sense in a military context. It was a statement. It was the architectural equivalent of the Mambo's political authority, massive, permanent, precisely constructed, built to be seen from a distance and to communicate, before any word was spoken, the nature of the power that resided within. Inside the great enclosure, the conical tower, a solid structure of dressed granite, tapering from its base to its top, approximately 10 meters high, stood as the most enigmatic element of the entire complex. Its function has been debated by every scholar who has examined it. No interior space, no military purpose, no obvious utilitarian function. The most compelling interpretation, supported by the Shona oral tradition that connects the tower to the symbolism of grain storage and agricultural abundance, is that it was a symbol of prosperity, a statement in stone that the kingdom was well fed and well governed, that the Mambo whose capital this was had maintained the connections with the ancestral spirits that kept the rain coming and the crops growing and the cattle multiplying. The stone spoke. And the entire Indian Ocean world, in the 14th century, was at its height, between approximately 1300 and 1420. Great Zimbabwe was one of the most significant political and commercial centers in the southern hemisphere. The population estimates for the city, at its peak, range across scholarly literature from 10,000 to 18,000 people, numbers that, in the context of 14th century Africa, represented a concentration of urban population that was genuinely remarkable. Most of the plateau's population lived in small farming and herding communities, whose scale was determined by the carrying capacity of the local land. Great Zimbabwe was different, a city in a meaningful sense, sustained by the economic flows that the gold and cattle trade generated, whose population was fed not primarily by the city's own agricultural hinterland, but by the tribute and trade that its political authority commanded. The spatial organization of the city reflected the social hierarchy of the political system it housed. The hill complex, the original stone enclosures on the granite kabja, was the domain of the Mambo and the senior spiritual practitioners. Access was restricted. The physical separation of the ruler from the general population was architectural as well as social. You had to climb, literally, to reach the power center. And the climb itself was a physical enactment of the social distance between the ruler and the ruled. The valley ruins. The complex of stone enclosures in the valley below housed the elite of the kingdom, the senior wives of the Mambo, the great chiefs and Sadunhu who attended the royal court. The merchants' commercial activities were the economic engine of the whole. And surrounding both, in the organic spread of a city that had grown rather than been planned, the thatched structures of the general population, the craftsmen, the miners, the farmers, the servants, the warriors, whose daily work kept the city functioning. The craft production of Great Zimbabwe was sophisticated and diverse. Iron smelting produced the tools and weapons that the agricultural and military economy required. Gold was worked, not at Zimbabwe itself in significant quantities. The mining happening at the regional deposits scattered across the plateau. But at Zimbabwe the gold arrived as tribute and as trade goods and was worked into the forms that the coastal trade demanded. Copper, traded from the great deposits of the copper belt far to the north, arrived at Zimbabwe and was worked into the ornaments, bracelets, anklets, the elaborate personal adornments that the elite wore as markers of status. Soapstone, the soft, easily carved stone found in the plateau's geology, was worked into the distinctive Zimbabwe birds, carved figures that topped ceremonial poles, and whose symbolic meaning the oral tradition connects to the Mindoro ancestral spirits that were the foundation of the Mambo's spiritual authority. The Zimbabwe birds. 8 of them recovered from the ruins, carved from soapstone, each approximately 40 centimeters tall, each representing a bird of uncertain species, part raptor, part human in some features, the beak and the feet at the boundary between the natural and the supernatural. They stood on their poles in the hill complex's enclosures. They watched over the capital from the highest point of the landscape. They were, in the material culture of Great Zimbabwe, the most evocative objects, the ones whose meaning the oral tradition preserves most insistently, and whose loss, when colonial looters removed them from the site in the 19th century, represents the most visible of the many acts of cultural vandalism that the archaeological site has suffered. The Indian Ocean trade connections at Great Zimbabwe's peak were extensive and well documented in the archaeological record. Chinese porcelain, Yuan and early Ming dynasty ceramics, dating to the 13th and 14th centuries, appears in the ruins in quantities and in contexts that demonstrate it was a prestige good, something the elite possessed and displayed as evidence of their connections to the wider world. Persian and Arab glass beads, found in extraordinary numbers across the site, were the trade currency of the Indian Ocean system, the standard medium through which interior African commodities were purchased by coastal merchants. Cotton cloth, which does not survive in the archaeological record, but whose importation is documented in the coastal trading records, and in the oral tradition, was among the most valued trade goods flowing into the interior. In exchange gold. The plateau's gold, in the 14th century, was reaching the Indian Ocean coast at Sofala in quantities that made the Sofala trade one of the most commercially significant on the East African coast. From Sofala, the gold moved to Kilwa, the great Swahili trading city on the Tanzanian coast whose prosperity in this period was built substantially on its control of the Sofala gold trade, and from Kilwa into the dhow routes of the Indian Ocean, to Arabia and India and ultimately to the mints and treasuries of the medieval Islamic world. A gold coin minted in Cairo or Damascus or Delhi, in the 14th century, might contain gold that had been mined on the Zimbabwean plateau, traded through Great Zimbabwe, exported through Sofala, shipped through Kilwa, and worked at its destination into the form of currency. The connections were real. The distances involved were vast. The organizational capacity required to maintain them was considerable. the Mambo who presided over this system. And the historical record does not give us their individual names with the certainty that the monuments they built deserve. Was governing something more than a regional chiefdom. He was governing the African end of an Indian Ocean commercial system that connected the plateau to the economies of 3 continents. He was performing the spiritual functions that the Karanga political tradition required of its rulers, and maintaining the ancestral connections that kept the rains coming, and the cattle multiplying, and the gold appearing in the riverbeds. He was managing the tribute system that incorporated the plateau's regional communities into the kingdom's economic and political structure. He was receiving foreign merchants and diplomats at his capital, and sending his own representatives to the coastal trading cities. He was a king, in every sense that word carries. The stone walls around him were proof of it. The smoke rose from 10,000 cooking fires. The cattle lowed in their enclosures. The gold dust was weighed in the trading compounds. The ancestors were consulted in the hill complex's sacred spaces. The Zimbabwe birds watched over everything from their poles on the summit. This was the world. It was complete. It was sufficient unto itself. It could not last forever. Nothing ever does. The decline of Great Zimbabwe was not a catastrophe. It was something more insidious. A slow erosion of the conditions that had made the city's power possible. A gradual shift in the balance of factors that the Mambo and his predecessors had so skillfully managed for 2 centuries. The first and most fundamental challenge was environmental. The plateau's carrying capacity for cattle was not unlimited, and the concentration of population and livestock, at and around Great Zimbabwe, 10,000 or more people, and their associated cattle herds, was placing demands on the local environment that the environment could not sustainably meet. The grasslands within the cattle's practical ranging distance of the city were being overgrazed. The firewood required to heat the city's cooking fires and smelt its iron was stripping the woodland cover from the surrounding hills. The agricultural land needed to supplement the grain tribute in feeding the population was being worked continuously, without the fallow periods that the soil's productivity required. The land around Great Zimbabwe was, by the early 15th century, showing the signs of a civilization that had exceeded the sustainable limits of its specific location. The solution to this problem, the solution that the Karanga political tradition would eventually produce, was movement. The Mutapa state, which emerged in the 15th century as the successor political form to the Zimbabwe kingdom, did not collapse and disappear. It relocated. The center of political and economic power moved northward, toward the Zambezi Valley, where the gold deposits were richer, the grasslands less depleted, and the trade connections with the coastal networks more direct. The ruler, the Mambo, who would be remembered in the Portuguese records as the Mutapa, the lord of the plundered lands, the master of the conquered countries, took his court northward. He took the spiritual authority, the tribute networks, the commercial relationships that had been centered at Zimbabwe, and relocated them to a new capital, in the northern plateau. But the environmental pressure alone does not fully the timing and nature of Great Zimbabwe's decline. There was also the question of the gold trade itself. Specifically, of the opening of new gold producing regions that competed with the plateau's traditional deposits for the attention of the coastal merchants. The Buchua kingdom, which developed in the western plateau in the 15th century under the Towa dynasty, controlled gold deposits and trade routes that offered the coastal merchants and alternatives that ran through the Zimbabwe kingdom's territory. Competition for the gold trade, the economic foundation of the Zimbabwe kingdom's power, was developing at precisely the moment when the kingdom's environmental limitations were becoming most acute. The political challenges that these structural pressures generated were not small. The tributary system that had held the plateau's regional communities in relationship with the Zimbabwe center was held together by the Mambo's ability to deliver benefits, the protection, the trade access, the spiritual legitimacy that made tributary status worthwhile for the regional chiefs. When the Mambo's ability to deliver those benefits was compromised by the environmental and economic challenges of the early 15th century, the tributary system's coherence became vulnerable. Regional chiefs who had been loyal clients of the Zimbabwe center began to calculate whether that loyalty was still in their interest. The oral tradition preserved by the Karanga, Karanga-speaking Shona peoples, who are the cultural descendants of Great Zimbabwe's builders, is, in this period, a record of political fragmentation, of the dissolution of the unified political authority that the stone city had represented, and its replacement by the multiple successor states that divided the Plau's political landscape in the 15th and 16th centuries. The Mutapa state in the north, the Towa state in the west, the smaller chieftains that filled the spaces between them. The political unity of the Zimbabwe kingdom, never absolute, always contested at its margins, that always maintained through the continuous effort of rulers who understood that the tributary system required constant management, dissolved into the mosaic of regional powers that the Portuguese would find when they arrived on the plateau in the 16th century. The city did not fall in battle. There is no evidence, in the archaeological record, or the oral tradition, of a military conquest that ended Great Zimbabwe's occupation. The city was not burned, the walls were not thrown down, the Zimbabwe birds were not toppled by enemy hands. The city was left. The population departed. Some following the Mutapa court northward, some dispersing to the regional communities that had always surrounded the capital, some establishing the smaller satellite sites that appeared across the plateau as the centralized power, the Zimbabwe kingdom, dissolved. The fires went out. The grain bins emptied. The cattle moved away with their herders. The merchants stopped coming. The tribute stopped flowing. The hill complex's sacred fires, tended for generations by the spiritual practitioners who maintained the Mambo's connection with the ancestral world, were extinguished for the last time. The walls remained empty, precisely fitted, built to last, waiting for the next people who would try to understand what they meant. The Portuguese, when they learned of the great stone city in the interior, could not accept what they were being told. The reports came first from the Pombeiros, the interior traders, and then from the Portuguese explorers who reached the plateau in the early 16th century. There was a city of stone. The walls were massive. The construction was extraordinary. The people living among the ruins, the Karanga-speaking communities whose ancestors had built the city, and whose oral tradition maintained the connection, described it as the work of their forebears, the seat of their ancient kings. The Portuguese did not believe them. The colonial ideology that the Portuguese brought to Africa, the ideology that justified the slave trade, the territorial conquest, the political subjugation of African peoples by asserting that those peoples were incapable of the political and cultural achievements that history had assigned to Europe, could not accommodate a stone city of this scale built by Africans. The expedition had to come from elsewhere. The gold trade had to connect to Solomon's mines. The walls had to have been built by Phoenician traders or Arab merchants or any ancient Mediterranean civilizations whose achievements the European tradition had already incorporated into its self-image. The Portuguese explorer Antonio Fernandes, who reached the plateau around 1511-1514, was among the first Europeans to report on the ruins. His account was accurate in its essentials: stone walls, no mortar, large enclosures. But the interpretive framework he and his successors applied to those accurate observations was not. The myth of Ophir, the biblical land of gold from which Solomon's ships returned laden with treasure, was mapped onto the Zimbabwean plateau, with the enthusiasm of people who needed the myth to be true. The denial deepened in the 19th century, when European exploration of the African interior brought the ruins to the systematic attention of European scholarship and popular culture. Karl Marx, the German geologist who reached Great Zimbabwe in 1871 and produced the first detailed European account of the ruins, declared them to be the work of a Phoenician or Israelite civilization, the palace of the Queen of Sheba, or a copy of Solomon's temple. His evidence for this attribution was approximately non-existent. His certainty was absolute. The evidence he chose to ignore, the oral traditions of the Karanga people, the material continuity between the ruins and the living culture around them, the African pottery and artifacts found throughout the site, was the evidence that was actually there. The colonial administration of Rhodesia, the territory named for Cecil Rhodes, the British imperialist whose vision of a Cape to Cairo British Empire had driven the colonization of the Zimbabwean plateau in the 1890s, institutionalized the denial. The Zimbabwe ruins, as the colonial administration called the site, were officially attributed to a non-African civilization. This was not an archaeological conclusion. It was a political decision made by a colonial government that understood, correctly, that African authorship of the ruins undermined the ideological justification for the colonial project. A civilization that built Great Zimbabwe did not need European guidance. A people whose ancestors created one of the greatest architecturements of the medieval world were not the backward, ungoverned savages that colonial ideology required them to be. Richard Hall, the first official curator of the Zimbabwe ruins, appointed by the Rhodesian government in 1902, conducted excavations at the site with a methodology whose primary purpose appears to have been the removal of evidence of African occupation. He cleared the site. He threw away pottery. He removed the stratigraphic layers that would allow later archaeologists to date the construction and establish the cultural sequence of the site's occupation. He was not conducting science. He was conducting a search for evidence of the non-African origin theory, and when the evidence he found was not what he was looking for, he removed it. The scientific response began almost immediately. David Randall McKeever, a British archaeologist sent to examine the site in 1905, by the British Association for the Advancement of Science, produced a report that was unequivocal. Great Zimbabwe was of African origin, built by the ancestors of the Shona people, who still lived in the region, dating to the medieval period and not to biblical antiquity. His conclusions were attacked, dismissed, and ignored by the Rhodesian colonial establishment. Gertrude Caton Thompson, a British archaeologist who conducted excavations at the site in 1929, confirmed Randall McKeever's conclusions with more extensive stratigraphic evidence and more systematic methodology. Her conclusions were also attacked. The scientific consensus was clear by the mid-20th century. The political resistance to that consensus persisted until Zimbabwe's independence in 1980. The white minority government of Ian Smith's Rhodesia, which declared independence from Britain in 1965 in order to maintain white minority rule, officially suppressed archaeological publications that affirmed African authorship of Great Zimbabwe. Government published tourist guides, continued to attribute the ruins to ancient Phoenicians. A guide to the monument produced in the 1970s omitted the word African from its description of the builders. The denial was not a footnote. It was a policy. And its final defeat, the moment when the political authority that had sustained it was removed, came with the independence of Zimbabwe in 1980. When the new nation chose its name from the stone walls that colonial ideology had tried to make the property of everyone, except the people who actually built them. The ruins did not move. The walls did not change. The stones waited with the patience of stone, for the truth that was always in them to be acknowledged. Great Zimbabwe is a World Heritage Site. It has been since 1986, on the UNESCO list of places whose significance to humanity is sufficient to warrant international protection. The designation is real and the protection, imperfect as such protections always are in practice, is real. The site is studied. It is visited. It is in the scholarship of the past 40 years. Better understood than at any previous point. The stratigraphic sequences are being re-established. The material culture is being reanalyzed with modern techniques. That the connections between the archaeological record and the living oral traditions of the Shona speaking people are being mapped with the seriousness they deserve. The name of a nation. That is perhaps the most extraordinary expression of Great Zimbabwe's enduring significance, the fact that an entire country chose to name itself after the stone walls of a medieval city. Zimbabwe, the houses of stone. The venerated houses. The name that the Karanga oral tradition had preserved for the centuries of Portuguese contact and the centuries of colonial denial is now the name on the passports of 14 million people. On the currency, on the international agreements, on the maps of the world. The renaming was not merely symbolic. It was a political and cultural declaration. This is whose country this is, whose history this is, whose achievement this is. The scientific questions that remain are genuinely fascinating and not yet fully resolved. The population at peak occupation is estimated but not confirmed. The precise political structures of the Zimbabwe kingdom, the specific mechanisms of the tribute system, the relationship between the Mambo and the Mindoro spirit mediums, the degree of centralization in the governance of the far-flung tributary network, are reconstructed from the combination of archaeological evidence and oral tradition and comparative ethnographic analogy. But the written sources that might provide direct confirmation simply do not exist. The relationship between Great Zimbabwe and its predecessor Mapangabwe, between Great Zimbabwe and its successor Mutapa state, between the Zimbabwe archaeological culture and the broader family of stone-walled sites that archaeologists have identified across the Zimbabwean plateau, more than 200 of them, ranging from the massive scale of Great Zimbabwe itself to small local enclosures, is still being worked out. The oral tradition preserved by the Shona, speaking communities whose ancestors built and inhabited Great Zimbabwe, is one of the most underutilized resources in the site's historiography. The colonial dismissal of African oral testimony as an unreliable source, a dismissal that was ideologically motivated rather than methodologically justified, created a gap between the archaeological record and the living cultural memory that the scholarship of the independence era has been working to close. The Mindoro spirit possession tradition, still practiced, still carrying the names and the histories of the ancestors whose authority was centered at Great Zimbabwe, is a living archive of information about the political and spiritual culture of the kingdom that the stone walls cannot, by themselves, provide. The Zimbabwe birds, the soapstone carvings that were removed from the site by Cecil Rose's British South Africa Company in the 1890s, and that ended up scattered across the world, in collections in Berlin and Cape Town and private hands, have been the subject of a repatriation effort that has partially succeeded. Some of the birds have been returned to Zimbabwe, where they are displayed in the museum at Great Zimbabwe. Others remain outside the country. Their return, and the continued effort to secure the return of those still abroad, is not merely a question of museum policy. It is a question of cultural sovereignty. The right of a people to possess the symbols of their own civilization. The commercial connections that Great Zimbabwe mediated, the Indian Ocean trade networks that carried the plateau's gold to the markets of Arabia and India and China, were part of a global commercial system that modern scholarship has come to recognize as far more integrated, far earlier, than the older Eurocentric historical narrative acknowledged. The Chinese porcelain at Great Zimbabwe, the glass beads from Persia, the cotton cloth from India. These are the material evidence of a pre-Columbian global economy whose African nodes were as significant, as sophisticated, and as consequential as those in Asia or the Middle East. The story of the world before European expansion is not a story of isolated, disconnected civilizations. It is a story of connections, of trade routes and cultural exchange and the movement of ideas and goods across the entire extent of the old world. Great Zimbabwe was part of that story. It was a significant part. And the scholarship that has recovered its significance has contributed to the larger project understanding the world's history on its actual terms, rather than the terms that European colonial ideology imposed on it. The walls stand in the valley south of the Masvingo Plateau, in the country called Zimbabwe, in the landscape that the cattle economy and the gold trade bit into one of the medieval world's most remarkable civilizations. The grasses grow in the cracks between the stones. The granite blocks, fitted with the precision of builders who knew what they were doing and did it well, have not moved. The conical tower stands in the great enclosure, its meaning still not fully agreed upon, its presence still commanding. The hill complex looks down on the valley below with the permanent authority of elevation, the same authority it communicated to everyone who approached it 8 centuries ago. The Zimbabwe birds have come home. Most of them. Their carved eyes look out over the landscape their makers built. The ancestors are still here. In the stone. In the name. In the people who carry the name forward. They built this. They knew it would last. They were right. The houses of stone do not forget who built them, and the world, finally, is learning to remember.